Our tonight's speaker, William Gilbert, is known to many of you for his contribution to archaeology in Newfoundland. He holds a bachelor's degree in North Atlantic history and a master's degree in archaeology, both from Memorial University, and has worked as a professional archaeologist for over 40 years. In 1988, he and fellow archaeologist Ken Reynolds discovered the Russell's Point Beothic site using information contained in John Guy's account of his 1612 voyage into Trinity Bay. And between 1994 and 97, he directed the excavations at that site, Russell's Point. At the same time, he and his crew from the Bacaloo Trail Heritage Corporation surveyed Cupids and discovered the original settlement established there by John Guy in 1610, one of the oldest in the Americas. Bill has directed the excavation at Cupids every year since. He has also published papers on the history and archaeology of Newfoundland in a number of journals, including the Newfoundland Quarterly, Newfoundland Labrador Studies, Avalon Chronicles, Acadiensis, and Post-Medieval Archaeology. He's also, he tells me, in the process of publishing a couple more papers and hopefully a book, which we all look forward to, I'm sure. Now, the title of his talk is The Cupids Cove Plantation, discovered by William Gilbert in 1995, as I've already said. In this talk, he will give an overview of how archaeology at Cupids and documentary research at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, the National Archives at Kew in London, and archives here in Newfoundland have enhanced our understanding of this important site over the past 29 years. So, Bill?
You need the microphone? Okay. Okay. I don't want to hold it. Put it up here. Can everybody hear me okay? Can we have the lights turned down, please? I want it dark in here. You don't want to look at me, you want to look at the screen. And I would suggest, actually, if anybody that can't see the screen very well, that's not dark enough. Dark. Black. That's good. Yeah, here we go. And if you can't see the screen if you're over there, there's a few seats over here you can move over. You see it a lot better, right? But anyway, so thank you. Thanks to everybody. Thanks to the Newfoundland and Labrador Historical Society for inviting me here to give this talk. It's a real honor, and thanks to everybody for coming out and to see this presentation. I think you've already done my introduction. You covered a few things that I was going to talk about, but I'm going to start with what should be a pretty obvious statement to everybody here, and that's that the first English settlement in what is now Canada was established at Cupids in Conception Bay, Newfoundland in 1610 by a consortium of London and Bristol merchants, the Newfoundland Company. And the first governor was a Bristol merchant by the name of John Guy. To give you a little bit of background about how what's that doing? Okay. Okay, I clicked the wrong way. Yeah. Okay. To give you a little bit of background about how I became involved with Cupids, we need to skip overland about 15 miles to the west of this place. So this is Russell's Point Beothic site in Dildo Pond in Blaketown in Trinity Bay. And this site was visited by colonists from Cupids on the 26th of October, 1612. And two of those colonists, John Guy and Henry Kraut, wrote detailed accounts of what they saw there. That's up again. Oh, decline. Decline? I don't know. Okay, so it's okay. John Guy, okay, it's throwing me off here. The site was visited by colonists from Cupids on the 26th of October, 1612. And two of those colonists, John Guy and Henry Kraut, wrote detailed accounts of what they saw at this Beothic site, which have survived. And also, I grew up about half a mile up the road from here. My house is, I wish I had a pointer. My house is just up there. That's where I grew up, about half a mile up the road. So I know the area quite well. Back in 1988, myself and my good friend and fellow archaeologist Ken Reynolds decided that we were going to do a survey of Dildo Pond to see if we could find the Beothic site. Now, what have I got up on the screen? Okay, let's go. And we did find the site here at Russell's Point in 1994. Oh, I've got a pointer, actually. I've got one here. You already gave me one. I have two laser pointers home, but I forgot to bring them. In 1994, the Backwood Trail Heritage Corporation, for whom I worked for 29 years, I guess, they procured funding to conduct excavations at this site. I supervised the excavations at the site, and I wrote my master's thesis on it. And we really quickly, just to let you know, we found out a lot about Russell's Point, but we now know, based on the work that we did there, that Russell's Point was a fall and winter base camp used by the Beothuk to hunt caribou and store the meat over the winter, and that it was occupied by the Beothuk seasonally for over 600 years before John Guy and his men even arrived. The earliest radiocarbon date we've got from the site is 970 AD, so long before John Guy. The Russell's Point site in 1994 generated a lot of public interest, a lot of media coverage, and it also attracted the interest of the Cupids Historical Society, the members of which were beginning to plan for the 400th anniversary of Cupids. And while we were here digging, I was approached by Roy Daw, who was then the chair of the Cupids Historical Society, and he said, well, if you can find Beothuk sites in Trinity Bay using documents from Cupids, why don't you come to Cupids and see what you can find? So I said, well, we'll go for it for sure. So the Backwood Trail Heritage Corporation agreed to incorporate an 8-week survey of Cupids in the program of excavations and survey work we had planned for the next year for 1995. We secured the funding, and I started work there on the 7th of June, 1995, and I've pretty well been there ever since. Before we started digging, went in there and started digging holes in the ground, I went back to the original documents to see if I could find some clues to help narrow down the location of the site. And just to give you an idea of what some of those documents are or were, this is Sir William Alexander's An Encouragement to Colonies, published in 1624. Sir William Alexander was a Scottish knight who named Nova Scotia, and had plans to establish a Scottish colony in Nova Scotia. Actually, they ended up spending the winter of 1623 in St. John's. That's a different story. I may get to that later on. But in An Encouragement to Colonies, on page 25, he says, the first houses for a habitation were built in Cupid's Cove within the Bay of Conception, where people did dwell for sundry years together, and some well satisfied, both for pleasure and profit, are dwelling there still. This is an important compilation of documents here. This is Samuel Purchas's Pilgrims, the 1624 edition of which, volume 5, included for the first time a number of transcriptions of letters from the original colony, some of John Guy's letters that he wrote. There's also a transcription, an edited transcription of John Guy's journal of the voyage into Trinity Bay. This guy is Sir Percival Willoughby. Sir Percival was one of the main investors in the Newfoundland Company. He had been granted land, basically all the land from the north side of Carbonear right on up to Bay de Verde is the land that he was granted as part of his share for being a part of the colony, or part of the company. His private archive, consisting of letters and a bunch of other documents, has survived. It survived for many years here. This is the Walleton Hall, which is Sir Percival's manor house. They're now housed at the University of Nottingham Library, and they include 19 letters written in Newfoundland between 1610 and 1631, a number of other documents written during that period, correspondence and other documents that were written in England but talk about what was going on in Newfoundland during that time. And they also include this. This is, well, the first page of Henry Crout's diary. Henry Crout arrived in Newfoundland in 1612, and he kept a diary at Cupids from the 1st of September 1612 to the 13th of May 1613, which has been an invaluable source of information for me, certainly. And this is Lambeth Palace in London, and this is where John Guy's journal of the Voyage of the Endeavour is housed. And this is the page of his journal that talks about Russell's Point, the Beothuk site at Russell's Point. He doesn't call it Russell's Point, obviously, but he talks about that Beothuk site on Dildo Pond. Those documents defined an area of about a half a kilometer from west to east. And this is us digging our first test pits on the 7th of June, 1995. And we started at the western end and worked our way east. And pretty quickly, we could eliminate about 80% of the survey area. Because as the local people told us, all that low ground, which made up about 80% of the survey area, was originally wet ground that had been filled in over the last couple of hundred years so people could build their houses there. So it would have been a marsh, basically, in the 17th century. And that left this nice level terrace at the eastern end of our survey area. It's about 4 meters above the low ground to the west. And this is where we found the site. We initially found some 17th century artifacts under some trees that had fallen down. That's how we walked up on the terrace and we started finding 17th century artifacts. Once we knew we had a 17th century site, we ran lines to define the perimeters of the site. This is what the crew is doing here. They're digging test pits at 5-meter intervals along the perimeter of the site. Now, John Guy tells us in his second letter he wrote in May of 1611 that when they arrived, they cleared the land so far back, they enclosed an area that was 120 feet by 90 feet, and they built their first dwelling house, the storehouse, inside that enclosure. So we still had 6 weeks left once we defined the perimeters of the site. So we went into the middle of it, and we opened a 1 meter by 10 meter trench. And I sort of jokingly said to the crew, I said, well, you know, if we're lucky, maybe we'll strike a building. And we were really lucky. This is what the feature looked like first when it began to emerge. This is what it looked like 2 years ago when we had it exposed. This is the chimney base with a 6-foot wide brick-lined fireplace built into it. It's located at the southern end of a 36-foot long building. Divided into 2 main rooms. The room at the south end had a wooden floor, which the building burnt in about 1670. This is part of the burnt timbers from the floor. The room at the north end had a cobblestone floor. This is part of that cobblestone floor. Just to show you a few of the artifacts that we found. We found a number of these clay pipes that were made in London between 1590 and 1610. I think there's 3 of them that we found around the dwelling house. This is an Elizabethan silver 4-pence, minted at the Tower of London sometime between October 1560 and December 1561. And it was well worn. You can see it's very worn. So it was in circulation for a long time. This is an amber bead. Now, the amber bead is not real period specific. It's kind of period specific, but it's very significant because John Guy says he had amber beads and he took amber beads with him into Trinity Bay to trade with the Beothuk in 1612. I think there's a very good chance that this is one of the amber beads that fell out of John Guy's pocket or purse before he left for Trinity Bay. And this is part of a Raren jug, a rim of a Raren jug, made in Belgium sometime between 1580 and 1600. We found thousands of artifacts, and I could spend hours talking about artifacts, but I'll take too long. So this is what the footprint of the building looked like in the ground when it was exposed. This is the dwelling house. This is the 1610 dwelling house. There's absolutely no doubt about that now. A couple of the artifacts that we found inside the dwelling house were things like this Westerwald bottle, Bellarmine stoneware bottle, I'm sorry, that dates to about 1650. It was found just in front of the fireplace up around here. We've got a much more date-specific Charles II silver half crown, minted sometime between 1660 and 1662. That was found here on the burnt timbers right here. That tells us, well, it tells us that this building was still standing at least in 1660 because that coin was inside it. And cannonballs. We found some cannonballs. We found lots of things in the house, but just to give you an idea. You may want to keep the cannonballs in mind because I talk about the defenses a bit later on. I'll go back just for a second. If you look, I wish I had my pointer, but if you look up here, you can see there's a pit just to the east of the chimney base. And when we dug into that pit, we found this is what's left of a stone wall cellar, 7 feet below the surface. The bottom is 7 feet below the surface. And when we expanded the excavation a bit farther to the east, we found this. So can you see my? Oh, you can see my pointer there, right? So we found this, which is the builder's trench for the building that was built over this. This is the store. This is the storehouse. This building extended east from the south end of the dwelling house where the fireplace is and connected to the fireplace for 30 feet, and this cellar was built down inside of it. So we have a really good footprint of those two buildings, and this is what we think they would have looked like. We're saying 1612, the autumn of 1612, but we have a really good. I think this is pretty accurate. I mean, if you read some of the really early histories, you read Anspach and those guys, they'll say, based on nothing, basically, they say, well, John Guy came and he built huts. He put up huts. Prowse goes on, Prowse talks about a manor house. Guy built a manor house. It's neither of those. Basically what it is it's a merchant's premises. Very typical of something you see in the West Country at this time. The only difference is that this is a wooden frame building with clapboard, which as soon as the English arrived in North America, they started building with clapboard, as opposed to a half timber building, which is what you find in the west of England at this time. And this is the ghost structure that we built over the footprint of the building in 2010, so people could get some idea of what the building would have looked like, but still use their imagination. So this is the layout of those two buildings as they would have been originally. We found a number of structures inside the enclosure, but I only have time really to talk about one, so I'm going to talk about this one. This is a building just to the south of, this is the trench for the storehouse, and this is the pit for the storehouse. Just south of the storehouse, running parallel to it. The dwelling house and storehouse burnt in about 1670s, give or take a few years. And when we found this building first, I assumed that this building would have been abandoned around the same time. But when we looked at the artifacts that came out of it, we found stuff like this. These wine bottles have a date range of 1689 to 1700. This is a Westerwald cup from Germany, 1690, 1720. Nice pipe bowl, probably made in Exeter and Devon, and it dates to between 1680 and 1720. So what this tells us is that this building was still in use in the 1690s, and perhaps beyond that. And as you'll see as I go through, we have loads of evidence now that the site was occupied right from 1610 right up to the present day. We can trace the land ownership actually from 1610 up to the present day. At the north end of the enclosure, we found the base of a stone wall 3 feet wide. For a long time, this is the only part of it we had, because we couldn't get out onto the property farther to the west. But you can see there's a ridge running along here. So we were here for a couple of years looking over that fence thinking, man, I'd love to get out there and do some digging. So finally, in the fall of 2008, we did, and this is what we found. This is the base of a stone defensive wall, 3 feet thick, would have been about 6 or 7 feet high when it was up, facing the harbor in front of the enclosure where the dwelling house and storehouse were. To the north of that, about 39, 40 feet to the north of that, we cleared away the trees that were there and opened it up. And another feature began to emerge. You can see a wall coming up here now. This is the defense works. This is the defensive wall. Actually, this is the inner face of a wall that was actually 9 feet thick. This is the outer face. This would have been rubble filled. 9 foot thick wall. When it was up, it would have been, again, 6 or 7 feet high, 9 foot thick, overlooking the harbor in front of the plantation. And this feature up here, yeah, you can see that, can't you? Yeah. This feature up here, the semicircular feature, this is a platform for a cannon. So this is a gun platform. This is defense works. The enclosure is in here. This is the enclosure, and this is the stone wall at the north end of the enclosure. Now, this is all stonework. We know that the original defenses that John Guy built in 1610 were wooden. He talks about great post and rails set into ground, wooden palisades, that sort of thing. But we also know that in 1612, they were having a lot of trouble with pirates. I mean, everybody's heard about Peter Easton, and there's a lot of nonsense about Peter Easton. But it is true that he was in Newfoundland in 1612, and he did cause a lot of problems for the colonists and for the migratory fishermen. And we have several letters referring to what was going on. One of them, I should tell you who John Slaney is, because I don't think I've mentioned him yet. John Slaney was the treasurer of the Newfoundland Company, and him and his brother Humphrey were, well, majorly involved in the Newfoundland Company, but also ended up taking over Cupids and running Cupids in the 1620s. So this is a letter that John Slaney wrote to Sir Percival Willoughby on the 3rd of September, 1612. He says, Master Guy is now making a fort which is almost finished, which he writes will be impregnable again the next year if the pirates return. So I think all this stonework is construction from that when they upgraded the defenses in 1612. To get back to the original wooden enclosure and that they built in 1610, this is a post hole, big post hole. It's actually the northwest corner. It was dug to hold the northwest corner post of the palisade that they built, the 120-foot by 90-foot palisade. We know that now. And it's 3 feet south of the stone wall. As we opened this area up, we started finding more post holes. That's the one I just showed you. There's another one here. When the crew took the bulk out here, they found another one. They're 12 feet apart. They run parallel to that stone wall. This is the stone wall here. And once we had those exposed, you can see this is the line of the palisade here, running along here. The crew is holding posts where the post holes are. They're at 12-foot intervals. There's another post down here. This one is at the 96-foot mark. Again, a 12-foot interval. So what we did, we had the corner post, the northwest corner post. We had the line of the wall running this way. So we took a measuring tape and we measured from here for 120 feet. That took us to here, this post hole right here, and this whole pattern of posts and trenches in the ground. If you join all that up, it looks like this. So this is a section of the north wall. This is a section of the east wall. And this projection here is almost certainly one of John Guy's 2 flankers. So a flanker is a bastion for a cannon. And Guy says in his second letter, the 16th of May, he says, a square enclosure, 120 feet long, 90 foot broad, encompassing these 2 buildings right here, dwelling house and storehouse, with 2 flankers to secure the quarters. So give you an idea what a flanker would have looked like. This is an artist's conception from Martin's Hundred in Virginia. It's an English plantation that was established in 1619 and burnt by the Powhatan Indians in 1622. So it would have looked something like this. The palisade would have looked something like this as well. And you can see in this image here, man, who needs a pointer? Sure, I got this. That's perfect. That's better than a pointer. You can see this post hole here is 1 meter across. The 2 post holes at the back of the flanker are 1 meter across. They're there for huge posts. And that reason for that is that they're meant to take the recoil from the cannon when the cannon's fired, right? The ones in the front are a lot smaller. And this business here, where you can see these are decayed timbers here, and the clay in here is much finer than the actual clay. This clay was dumped here. It's much finer than the actual matrix, the subsoil in most of the area. We think what this is probably a parapet step, sort of like this here. So, and this gives you a better idea what a parapet step looks like. So basically you box in the palisade, you build a low wall about 2 or 3 feet back from it, you fill it full of clay, put steps up to it so that your musketeers can get up and fire over the wall. So I'm pretty sure that's what, this business is here. Okay, so, and in 2021, we extended the excavation. By the end of 2021, we had 50 feet of the trench that was dug for the east wall. This is the trench going this way. In 2022, we opened up another 6 meters. We expanded the excavation south for another 6 meters. We found a total of 65 feet of that 90-foot wall, the trench that was dug to put the palings in for that. South of that, it seems to be all gone. In 1979, Bill Norman, who put a trailer just up here. His trailer was up here on the site in 1979, dug a well and a well shaft and a well pit, and he just tore all this up. I mean, he didn't know what he was doing. God love him. He was a wonderful man, but he didn't know what he was doing. So we've lost probably 30 feet of the east wall of the palisade, but we are finding, this is part of the south wall of the palisade running along here. This is where the southwest post would have been. We've got 16 feet of that so far. And of course, this is where the dwelling house and storehouse were here. You can sort of almost picture it, can't you, really? So really, if we didn't dig any more, and we also have a couple of post holes from the west wall of the palisade as well. So if we didn't dig any more, just based on this, we pretty well have the line of the palisade that they built in 1610, but we will be digging more. We'll be looking for more. I don't know what that's doing there. Okay. Oh, and I have to talk about this I can only talk about it briefly because I could talk about this for half an hour, but this again, we're back to, this is where the flanker was here. This is the line of the east wall. This is the steps going up to the parapet step. This section here, it's a 1 meter by 3 meter section. I wasn't going to take it out, but I decided I would take it out because I wanted to get a better photograph of this trench. That's the only reason I took it out, was to get a good photograph of this because it was right up against the edge of the trench. When we took it out right here, we found this. So this is the Henry VII silver half grout minted in Canterbury sometime between 1493 and 1499. We got a lot of media attention when this was found, and of course people were saying, "Oh, maybe John Cabot visited Cupids in the 1490s or whatever." But we can go into more detail later if you want to ask me a question about it. But I'm pretty certain that this was a coin that came over with the colonists and was dropped probably by one of the guys who was working on the palisade wall. Really, and I think it was probably ported away for a long time before that because it doesn't have enough wear to have been in circulation for 120 years or whatever. But that's a whole story in itself. So we'll jump now we'll jump about 130 feet to the north, down close to where the water is, the salt water. It doesn't look like it there in this picture, I know, but if you look at this photograph from 1910 or a couple of years before, you can see this is this house. So the Spracklin house, which is the house this is where my office is now. It was built in about 1847, but you can see how close the water was back then to the house. So we started digging down here on the low ground next to where the bank rises up, the terrace rises up, and another building began to emerge. You can see it here. You can see more of it emerging here. And when we dug into the bank itself that rises up about 4 meters to the east, immediately to the east of this building, we discovered that there was a pit. The pit had been dug into the side of the bank, and it was full of rubble, and the rubble was full of early 17th century artifacts. Here's a couple of pieces of what looks like Totnes to me, I think, from the photograph. Coarse earthenware from Totnes in Devon. This is what the building looked like when it was fully exposed. It's 23 feet long, 14 3/4 feet wide. I'm pretty sure this was a storehouse for salt cod, close to the water. You could almost bring a boat in here back then. So, and of course, the way these guys were making their money is they were catching cod, salting it, drying it. But not only were they doing that, but they were also purchasing cod from migratory fishermen and storing that as well. And in August, September, they were shipping this off to places like Malaga in southern Spain. And that's how they were making their money, basically, right? So I think there probably would have been a number of these storehouses at different places around the harbor, close to the water's edge. When we dug into the bank and into the pit, as we dug down further and further down into it, we realized that the pit actually extends beneath this building. This pit predates this building. And based on the artifacts that came out of the pit, the rubble that was in the pit, it looks like the pit was filled in sometime before 1640. So, and there's just a couple of the artifacts. Here's part of a North Devon tall pot, a couple of fragments of North Devon tall pot. There's hundreds of things in this pit. We've got loads of artifacts. This is a clay pipe. That's one of the things that really helps us to date when the pit was filled in. Has a date range of about 1620 to 1640. So last year, we went back to this area for two reasons, which are related, obviously. We wanted to determine the shape of the pit, expose as much of it as we could, and see if we could determine its function, what it was for. So you can see, but it took us a long time. By the end of September, it was really starting to take shape. You can see a nice coroner here, and he's back again, whoever that is. And a couple of the artifacts, and again, there was hundreds of things that came out of this, but this is part of a West Somerset cup. This is another clay pipe with a date range of 1620 to 1640. For those of you who know about pipe stems too, pipe stem bore dating and stuff, most of the pipe stems from this pit are 8/64 bore diameter, which suggests a date range of, what's it, Barry, 1620 to 1650? That range, yeah. This is a nice little trade bead. We've got hundreds of trade beads from the site. And this is a brick, yellow brick, large yellow brick, which may be a Tudor brick. I just got an email this morning. I contacted somebody at the Museum of London who John Allen told me, a friend of mine in Exeter, is an archaeologist in Exeter, said he's an expert in, he'll tell you what this brick is. I just got an email from him this morning, and he said, you need to contact the chair of the British Brick Association. So he sent me the email of the chair of the British Brick Association. I'm going to be emailing him now in a couple of days. I think this is probably a London brick, probably a Tudor, what they call a Tudor brick, although it might be a little bit later. It might have been made shortly after Elizabeth passed away. So this, you can see the pit is starting to take shape here. Now, all this mess here, these tarps are over sandbags that we had to put down to keep this building from collapsing and the rubble in the pit from collapsing in. So it looks messy, but that's all we can do. We took this balk out, and you can see it even better here. And when you connect the dots, this is what you got. So you can't really call it rectangular because it's not right angles and stuff. It's a pit in the ground, but it's a long, four-sided pit. It's 12 feet wide and 21 feet long, dug into the bank. This is almost certainly a saw pit. We know that when foresters arrived in an area, either virgin forest or that hadn't been cut in a long time, where there are lots of trees in England, the easiest way to dig one of these things, if it's up on a terrace, is to dig right into the bank, right? If you go up on top of the terrace, again, to clear all the trees away, take up all the roots, and then dig a hole right in the middle. But this is a very common technique when you arrive in an area with virgin forest, is you dig your saw pit right into the bank like this. Saw pits, well, John Guy says, he mentions, well, I'll just read the quote. He says, "We have digged the saw pit hard by the seaside," which this is, not anymore, but the water was right there originally, "and put a timber house over it covered in pine boards, and there are 2 pair of sawyers working in it." Now, a regular saw pit for what, do you guys know how a saw pit works? Like one guy up, one guy down, and you're sawing logs into boards, right? Most of the literature that I've read that describe these things, a saw pit for 1 pair of sawyers would be 6 feet wide normally. This one's 12 feet wide, so it would have makes sense that it would be for 2 pairs of sawyers. I'm pretty sure this is the saw pit that John Guy dug and his men dug when they arrived in August of 1610. You can almost picture him doing it if you go out there and look at it. You look up onto this terrace, there's all these trees. What are we going to do, boys, right? And he's got sawyers with him, and we're going to dig right into this bank, and that's what we're going to do. So this year we're going back, because parts of this pit haven't been excavated yet. There's a section there. And we're going to widen the excavation out to see if we can find any post holes or other features that might be part of the timber house covered in pine boards that John Guy says was built over this thing. So I'm going to change tack a little. I'm going to have a little drink of water too, guys. I'm going to change tack now a little bit, and I'm going to talk about the documents and some of the research I've been doing over the past number of years. I mean, all of this is related to documents because it's historical archaeology, but more specifically about the documents. So I imagine most of you are familiar, or a lot of you are familiar with this book. This is the cover of Gillian Sell's English Enterprise in Newfoundland, which, even though it was published back in 1969, is still one of the best things that you can read about 16th and 17th century Newfoundland. It's extremely well researched, extremely well written, and extremely well annotated. And I'd recommend anybody, if you can get your hands on a copy of this too, and you're interested in 16th and 17th century Newfoundland, read this. Don't read Proust, read this. So one of the things that I've been doing, Gillian passed away 10 years ago, I think, about 10 years ago. I've been following up on some of the clues she left behind in this book to see if it could lead me to some new information about Cupids in the 17th century, Newfoundland in the 17th century, whatever. And one of the references that I've been following up on is this one here. It's a footnote from page 77. She says, there is a reference in an Admiralty Court deposition to the presence of a governor at the colony in the summer of 1621. Now, 1621, the governor was John Mason. So when I read this, I thought, well, this must be a reference to John Mason. If I can find this document, maybe it'll shed some new light on Mason's time in Newfoundland, or at least what was going on in Cupids in 1621. So a few years back, I went to the National Archives at Kew, and I found the document. This is it. This is the first page of it. This is, I know I couldn't first when I looked at this, I said, I'm never going to be able to read this, but now I can read it. I can read these documents quite easily now, but first it was really difficult. So this is the deposition given to the High Court of Admiralty of Humphrey Randall of Salcombe in the county of Devon, mariner, age 40 years or thereabouts. Now, this isn't the first or the earliest reference to Humphrey Randall in relation to Cupids or the Newfoundland Company. In 1613, we have a couple of documents from the Willoughby papers that refer to a voyage that Randall made to Newfoundland that year for the Slaney's, for John and Humphrey Slaney. We also have a reference to Randall sailing to Newfoundland in 1615, as it says here, as master of the Hope, belonging to Humphrey Slaney and others of the Newfoundland Company. The reason we know about that voyage is that on his way back to England off the coast of Kent, the ship was captured by pirates. He had to go into the High Court of Admiralty and give a deposition, and the deposition has survived, so it's been recorded. But poor old Humphrey wasn't having much trouble with pirates, or much luck with pirates, I tell you. In 1621, he sailed to Newfoundland again for the Slaney's, this time aboard the Spiricon, which is a ship from Salcombe in Devon. And when he arrived in Newfoundland, his ship was captured by pirates again. Later that season, another of the Slaney's ships arrived, the Exchange of London, captained by John Blake. Now, she was a big vessel. She was 200 tons, well armed. Blake heard what had happened, and he decided to go after the pirates. He did. He succeeded in getting Randall's ship back, and he also captured the pirate ship and brought it back to Cupids. It's pretty clear from the documents what Blake did. He made a deal with the pirates that if they peacefully surrendered the ships and their cargo, he would let them go, or at least give them a running start anyway. So that was the deal that they had made. It's fairly clear from the deposition. But what Randall says is that seeing the ship, the Exchange, to be too strong for them, they yielded themselves onto her voluntarily. Only they compounded, which means they conspired or came together, to enjoy such pillage as they had aboard her in their chests and pocket, being of light burden. So basically, the ship was brought back to Cupids, but the pirates were plotting to get at the cargo on the ship. And this is where Gillian Sell made a mistake when she read this document. This is I can do it with this, can I? This is the word that she thought was governor. She read as governor. It's down here as well. And I can see if you were scanning through this, you might make that mistake. This almost looks like a G, but it's not. It's actually a C. And what it actually is Codner. It's Codner. It's the surname Codner. And Codner was one of the pirates. So, and what Randall says is, in his deposition, he says, to the eighth, these numbers, the eighth, and that are just the questions that they ask him right in sequence. To the eighth, he saith that he did see the said Codner aboard the said ship after she was yielded up aforesaid. So then the colonists, realizing that the cargo that was in that ship was in danger of being stolen, took some of it and put it in the Plantation house. And then Randall goes on to say, and after part of the goods were landed and put into the Plantation house, one of the said Codner's men broke into the said house and took away some of the goods for which he was imprisoned there, and in this deponent's presence confessed the fact. So not only have we got the first English dwelling house in Canada, we've also got the first burglary in the first English dwelling house in Canada. Once I'd figured out, I went looking for this document, expecting to find some new information on John Mason's time in Newfoundland, and instead what began to emerge was this whole story of piracy. So I thought, well, there's a lot more people involved in this than just Humphrey Randall. There must be more depositions. So last year I went back to Kew and back to the National Archives, and I found 4 more depositions related to this case. This is one of them. This is the deposition of Richard Brett of Drayton in Shropshire, sailor. Now, Brett was aboard the pirate vessel while all this stuff was going on, but he claimed that he was there against his will. And this deposition is basically a detailed account of how that came to be and what these guys were up to before they came to Newfoundland. So Brett says that he was one of the crew of a ship called the Red Camel that sailed out of Flushing in the Low Countries. And in March 1620, they were carrying letters of marque from the Prince of Orange. This is when hostilities between Spain and the Low Countries and the Netherlands were starting to flare up again. They were carrying letters of marque from the Prince of Orange that gave them permission to take Portuguese and Spanish vessels as prizes on the high sea. So somewhere out on the ocean, they came across a Portuguese vessel, they captured it, and then a dispute arose between the captain and some of the crew, and the majority of the crew decided to go rogue and turn pirate. Brett says that they took the captain and those that remained loyal to him or most of them, put them in the Portuguese vessel and let them go. But for some reason, they held on to Brett. They kept Brett. Maybe he had some skill, some ability that they needed or whatever, but he claimed he was held on the ship against his will and sometimes held below decks as well, tied up or locked in below decks. But just to give you an idea of what these guys were up to, they sailed to Portugal, and it says off the river of Lisbon, they took a Hollander, that's a Dutch vessel. Then they sailed to the Canaries, the Canary Islands, where they took the Green Peacock, which is the ship that they took and converted to a pirate ship, and that's the one they sailed to Newfoundland in. Then they took a ship of London at the Canary Islands. They also took a Scottish ship, of which one Thompson was master. Then they returned to the river of Lisbon and took a Turkish prize laden with cinnamon and sugar and cloves and pepper and wine. So the really good stuff, the really high-end stuff. Then they took a ship of Topsham in Devon, laden with kerseys and serges and other like Devonshire commodities. Those are really fine cloth, woolen cloths that were very high-end, very expensive. And upon the coast of Barbary, that's in North Africa, they took a Frenchman. And when they got to Newfoundland, they captured a caravel before they captured Humphrey Randall's vessel. But he's also asked, Brett has also asked, well, you know, these guys have money? Because there's lots of rumors going around that, you know, these guys had money and they escaped with money. And he said, the company of the Peacock upon the coast of Barbary, North Africa, did truck and barter away many goods and commodities to the Moors for money. But how much money they received there, he cannot declare. And again, at Lanzarote, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, in the Canaries, a ship of London lately come from Virginia traded with them. And from that, they had 30 Spanish reals apiece. Real is a silver coin. It's what they used to call a piece of 8. So this is a load of money that they had when they finally left. And then they sailed directly for Newfoundland. So these are the guys that showed up, you know, in Conception Bay in the spring of 1621. We don't know what happened to most of those pirates, obviously. You know, some of them probably sort of paid their way back to England or whatever, or wherever they were from, and faded into obscurity. We don't know. You can use your imagination. I don't want to start any rumors about pirate treasure in Newfoundland because there's enough of those going around now. But we do know what happened to 2 of them. Randall is asked in one of the questions in the deposition, he's asked, one of the interrogatories as they call it, how many pirates there were aboard the ship when she was taken. And he says, to the 5th he saith, there were about 40 pirates in the said ship when she was yielded up to the said Blake. What has since become of them he cannot declare, save only 2 of them he brought to this port of London in the said ship. So you know who that is. That's Codner and Codner's man, who were captured in Cupids trying to steal the cargo from the ship. Well, one from the ship and one from the plantation house. So these guys would have been hung. I mean, piracy was a hanging offense. There's very little chance that they would have escaped. They were clearly guilty. They would have been taken to Wapping, down to execution dock. They would have been taken down to the gallows below the high water mark and hung from the gallows and probably left there for 3 or 4 weeks or whatever. Let's move on to something more pleasant, shall we? Okay, so this is some of you I'm sure know this place. This is the Bodleian Library in Oxford, 24th of April, 2017. This is the second time. Sorry. It went down the road. I'm good. Just take me a second. That's all. I'm okay. I took too big a mouthful. So this is the Bodleian Library, Oxford. It'll take me a second for my voice to come back properly. And I went to the Bodleian, following up on another clue in Gillian Sell's book, another footnote, and she says, in 1623, Humphrey Slamey set out a fishing voyage to Newfoundland, and his agent procured fish from the colony, that's Cupids, and elsewhere, which he sold in Malaga. So I went looking for this document, and the reference that he gives is Malone Manuscript 2, Bodleian Library, which he gives, Malone Manuscript 2 at the Bodleian Library. And I expected them to bring me out a little folder with a couple of sheets of paper in it. And instead, they brought me out this bound volume, it's like about that thick. I was amazed to see it. And what it is, or what it started life as, is the letter book of Richard Newell. So Richard Newell came to Newfoundland on a voyage for the Slaney's in 1623. He was aboard the Luke, and they had two goals in Newfoundland. One was to procure a cargo of Newfoundland salt cod to ship to southern Europe. The other was to transport those Scottish settlers who had been settled over the year before to settle in Scotland, settle in Nova Scotia, ended up spending the winter in St. John's. And they were supposed to take these people from St. John's back to Nova Scotia to continue setting up the colony. That didn't happen, actually. They ended up going back to England, but Scotland. And that's a whole other story. If I go into that, I'll be here for another half an hour. But so we'll concentrate mostly on Richard Newell and what he was up to. I'll go back for a second here. So this letter book contains 31 letters, 7 of them written in Newfoundland between the 8th of July and the 10th of September, 1623. There's also several letters that were written in Malaga after he got there, which talks about Newfoundland and things like the price of fish at the time in Malaga, that sort of thing. And the last letter that was written in Newfoundland is this one, and it was written to Captain John Mason, and it talks about mostly Humphrey Randall, Mr. Humphrey Randall. It turns out that Humphrey Randall was fishing in Colliers that summer, and he owed John Mason 1,700 weight of salt cod, and Mason had written Newell while he was in St. John's and requested that he go in and get this salt cod from Humphrey Randall. And Newell says in the letter, while he was in St. John's, he didn't have time to go to Colliers. So he sent his cousin, William Wills, in to talk to him. But Randall wasn't very cooperative. He wasn't going to turn over the fish. It doesn't sound like he had much of a very high opinion of John Mason either. But what happened after is that Randall, once he had his cargo of fish, he sailed out of Colliers. He was on his way. He was planning to cross the Atlantic to go to Spain or Portugal, wherever he was going to sell the fish. But the weather turned bad. Wind was the wrong way, and he was forced to come into Cupids. And that's where Randall and Newell met each other and had a bit of a conversation. These documents, this Malone Manuscript 2, is not a newly discovered document. I mean, it is referenced by a number of people, but it's never been properly mined for all the information that it contains about Newfoundland and the Newfoundland fishery. I've got all these documents, I've got all these letters transcribed now, all 31 of them. And I'm in the process of writing a paper which will give a good analysis of all this sort of stuff. But it talks about the agents in Malaga, it talks about the ships, it talks about, it's a whole story there, which I can't go into right now. But this is Dartmouth in Devon. This is back in 2011, I took this picture. The last 4 letters in Newell's letter book were written in Dartmouth in February of 1625. And he's in Dartmouth waiting for orders to leave again for Newfoundland on another voyage for the Slaney's. And the last letter is written to his cousin, William Wills, who at the time is in London. He's waiting for him to come down with another ship to join him on the voyage across. And I just wanted to read you this last little bit of the letter because I think it's kind of evocative, really. This is where it is right down here. He says, "I trust in God to see you here shortly, for you are earnestly expected of them here, in that the Newfoundland men make so much haste to be gone. wherever now 40 sail departed. So this is, what is it, the 24th of February, 1625. It says 1624 here, but you know how the calendars worked back then, right? This is actually 1625. The year changed in March for a lot of these guys. So he's in Devon, in Dartmouth, waiting to sail across to Newfoundland again. The 40 of the fleet have already left. It seems really early, but I think one of the reasons they left so early is that England and Spain a war was starting to break out again between England and Spain. And some of the ports farther east had already been shut down and ships weren't allowed to sail. This happened in Dover back in December. So I think the Dartmouth Newfoundland fishermen were leaving early before they were requisitioned by the military or by the crown to ferry troops over to Spain or something like that. So they were probably taken off earlier than they normally would have. But to get back to the point that I started out with, like the reason I went to look at this document, one of the main reasons was I wanted to see if it said who they bought the salt cod from in Cupids. Who was the person they bought it from? Because I had someone in my mind, and it turns out that that's actually who it is. It says here it's refers to Mr. or Master Hill. So Randall's talking about in St. John's about what he's going to do and how he's going to provision the ship with salt cod or lade it with salt cod. And he says which with the fish from Master Raleigh, that's Thomas Raleigh, who's living in Cupids, and some other which he is to receive from Master Hills at Cupid's Cove, and what we shall here make, I hope will finish up the ship. So this isn't the first reference to Master Hill. I've been wondering who the mysterious Master Hill was for a long time. The earliest reference that I've come across to a Master Hill in Cupids is from 1616. Henry Kraut, in a document, says that he has purchased 1/2 weight of salt cod from Master Hill. There are also a number of references in letters from 1621 or 1620, 1619. In 1619, September 1619, Thomas Rowley writes back saying that he and Master Hill would be leaving in 2 weeks' time for the bottom of Trinity Bay to trade with the Beothic. He doesn't call them Beothic, but those are the people he's talking about. And it's pretty clear that Master Hill was a well-established planter in Cupids. I think that Master Hill was the agent that the Slaney sent over to run the colony, and he stayed. We know that Cupids was still a place to go to buy salt cod in the 1630s. We have a record of a Dutch ship arriving with some merchants to purchase salt cod at Cupids. And we need to jump forward now quite a bit. So this is the last will and testament of Master James Hill, inhabitant of Cupid's Cove, 4th of March, 1674. I didn't find this document. Susan Snellgrove found this document back in 2009. She didn't realize the significance of it. Susan Snellgrove was an amateur genealogist. She found it, transcribed it, posted it on a genealogical site, and really didn't realize what it was. I phoned her up. She lives up in Toronto, or up in Ontario. I phoned her and I said, Susan, do you realize what you've found? And she said, no. She said, I thought it was, I'm just transcribing this stuff. I figured all historians knew about this stuff. I said, no, nobody's ever seen this document before. So this is what he says is in this will, James Hill, as for all my goods within and without the said house at Cupid's Cove, I wholly resign to Thomas Butler, now of Portagrave. Everybody knows what Portagrave is, I guess, across the harbor from Cupids. To him or his assignees, and to appoint him to be my lawful executor. And from the will too, I mean, this will was not, we're not just talking about a few pots and pans or something here. This will was probated in London the next year. So James Hill died sometime over that 12-month period. And jump forward a little bit more. I'm almost certain that this is the same Master Hill that's mentioned as being in Cupids in the 1620s. He would be fairly old. He'd be in his late 70s probably, but that's certainly not impossible. If it's not the original Master Hill, it's almost certainly his son. just a few little notes. Everybody knows about D'Iberville and D'Iberville's raid and how devastating it was on the English shore. There were 44 English settlements on the English shore at that time. Most of them were burnt by D'Iberville. But the next year, planters were coming back, people were coming back. We have a list of inhabitants designed to stay this year in the country in Newfoundland, compiled in 1698, and that includes a planter at Cupids. If somebody's coming back to Cupids in 1698 after D'Iberville has flattened the whole place, you'd be pretty sure he was in Cupids before that. He's not going to go back there. You know, this is not. I'm sure he was living there before that. We also have a list compiled in 1701 that records a planter and his wife and child living at Cupids. And I have to apologize for the quality of these documents because you can probably tell they're from microfilm. I should talk very briefly about the Colonial Secretary's letter book. Prior to 1749, all documents that were issued in Newfoundland were sent back to England. So all the repositories for all those documents they're now at the National Archives, those that have survived. In 1749, Governor Rodney created the first repository of official documents in Newfoundland, which is usually referred to as the Colonial Secretary's letter book. It includes, all kinds of official documents, but it also includes bills of sale, and it includes deeds for land, like that early, right? This is a document that was included in that, and this is a land grant, Mary Pinn's land grant. Mary Pinn was living in Mosquito Cove, which is Bristol's Hope in Conception Bay at the time, now called Bristol's Hope. And she says, I, Mary Pinn, being of sound memory, freely and fully give, grant, and confirm unto the said Henry Pinn, that's her son who's living in Bristol at the time, all in singular, the fishing room, meadow grounds, and meadow garden, being on the south side of Portagrave, commonly called Cupids, formerly being in the possession of Master James Hill, which the said Master James Hill legally gave to me. So, who's Mary Pinn? She's Thomas Butler's daughter. Who else would she be? James Hill's will says Thomas Butler or his assignees. We know that Thomas Butler had a daughter. I don't think there can be much doubt. So he's certainly one of his assignees, and I'd say it was his daughter. She's harking back to this, venerable person in the past who originally owned the land, Master James Hill, lawfully. For her to say lawfully gave it to me, I don't think there can be much doubt. We're going to go forward fairly fast in time now. So these documents are all here in Newfoundland, actually. These are from the Colonial Secretary's letter book. We'll jump forward a little bit. So this is the 12th of October, 1774. Henry Pinn died in 1750. His wife, Anne, married Michael Stretch, became Anne Stretch. I've heard that she was originally a Thistle from Harbor Grace, but I can't really confirm that. I think people say she was Anne Thistle originally. I'm sure there must be a document somewhere that can tell you that if that's the case. So on the 12th of October, 1774, Anne Stretch, Henry Pinn's widow, sold the Cupids property to the Harbor Grace merchant John Clements for £10. That's a good deal. I think there must have been something else going on there, between some other deal besides. And the £10 was just like, well, we'll give you £10 to write it off. So this is 1774. Oh, yes, and I should mention also as well, 1755, Dartmouth merchant William Newell establishes a premises here at Newman's Point in Cupids. And once that merchant premises is set up, population of Cupids starts to expand. By the early 19th century, there's about 400 people living in Cupids. Newman's Point, it doesn't look like anything in this photograph, but if you go over there, there's a nice level flat terrace, and there's stuff eroding out of the banks everywhere. There's storage jars and stuff. We went over and did a little bit of survey work one time, but it's never been looked at other than that. And we're moving into the early 19th century now. So on the 22nd of September, 1807, George Smith, who was resident of Cupids, John Clement died in 1802. George Smith, a resident of Cupids, entered into an indenture with Clement's executor to purchase the property known by the name or appellation of Cupid's Plain and extending from the Western Brook to Dick's Mead for £100. And we know exactly the boundaries of the Cupids Plain. I can show you on a map. We know it from the a Conception Bay Plantation book, which, as you may know, lists all the properties in Conception Bay in 1804, 1805, and gives the measurements along the harbors, and you can actually follow along and you can trace where they are. This is William Keating's plantation that was established in Cupids in the 1790s. We know that it was 601 yards from Keating's Road, which is here, to the eastern end of the plain, and I think it was 220 yards or something. Anyway, to the West Brook, which is right here. If you measure it off, it leads you right to the Western Brook right here. So this is the Cupids Plain. This is the area. This is a photograph from I showed you before, I think in a smaller version of it. This is a photograph from about 1910. The Cupids Plain is all of this. This is the Cupids Plain, all this area here, and a little bit further over as well. So it's a big piece of property. I don't know what happened. Maybe George Smith couldn't make the payments or whatever. The payments, he was making that £100 payment over 5 years at 20 pounds a year. Perhaps he couldn't make the payments. I don't know what happened, or he couldn't deal with the property, or he went bankrupt or whatever. But anyway, on the 25th of May, 1813, George Smith sold most of the property to Samuel Sprackland Jr. of Brigus for £70, and in 1825, Smith sold Samuel the remaining property. This is, let's go back. Oh, I'm going forward, aren't we? Let's go back. This is Samuel Sprackland's house up here that he built around 1813. We have the cellar for that house, but the house came down about 1920. This is his son John Sprackland's house, which is still there, which is the house that my office is in now. That was built in about 1847. Let's just go forward a little bit. Yeah, this is John Sprackland's house. When? About a year and a half ago, something like that. Yeah, my office is just up here. This map shows you the Cupids Plain in about well, not about 1908. This map was issued in 1908. And you can see at this point, half the property to the east has been taken over by the Norman family. I don't know exactly how that happened. I think the Normans married into the Sprackland family. Samuel, it's not Samuel at this point, but the Spracklands own all this land here. This little strip here, which I think is probably that last piece that they bought from George Smith. They probably kept that because it's very close to the Pointy Beach going out here, which is a perfect place to dry fish. I'm going to go back and just show you back to this one here. So you can see here, this is the boundary between the Norman land and the Sprackland land once it was divided in the 1830s. As I said, that's Samuel's house that he built around 1813. In 1925, John Sprackland Jr., Samuel's grandson, sold this part of the property to the Daw family. But this piece of property here was passed down through the maternal line. And I know Betty and Ruth are here, so I want to make sure I get their ancestors right. Samuel's eldest son, Simon, lived in this house. They used to call him Blind Simon. Apparently went to England to have some sort of operation on his eyes. In 1855, his daughter, Mary Charlotte, married Elias Ford. So the Fords inherited this land here. In 1892, Elias and Mary Charlotte's daughter, Priscilla, married Caleb Whalen. And the land was passed on through the Whalen family. And I guess Vern is here. So I guess by the 1960s, Vern owned the land, I guess. And at some point, he sold it or passed it on to his sister Ruth Whalen, who is the great, well, both Vern and Ruth are great grandchildren of Samuel Sprackland in 1813. And go forward a little bit more. So this is the Cupids Plain. This is the strip of land. Well, it's not marked out here, but this is where Ruth and Garland, when we arrived in Cupids in 1995, Ruth married Garland Baker, and so Ruth and Garland were still using this land as a summer home. They had a the trailer is still there. The trailer is still there. And it was on this piece of property that we found the first dwelling house and storehouse, part of the enclosure. So this is where the enclosure is, right here. So you can see we can actually trace land ownership in Cupids now from the 17th century right down to the present day. I'm almost finished, guys. I'm gonna make there's one more point that I'd like to make, and then I'll open it up to questions if you want. I'll try not to choke. I can't imagine that Cupids is the only place that was in Newfoundland that's been settled since the 17th century that this would happen. I'm sure if the paper trails were still there and you could find them, you could follow them, you'd be able to do this in places like Harbor Grace and Carbonear and Ferryland and probably in St. John's as well. I think as an idea for further research for someone, possibly, oh, there's the girls again. I think one of the best candidates for this would be Harbor Grace. Harbor Grace, this is the church, the Anglican church in Harbor Grace. I would be willing to bet that there's been a church on this land since the 17th century. This is a detail from a map of Harbor Grace that shows the houses in 1675. The church is just up here. Harbor Grace was the second English settlement in Canada. It was established by Bristol merchants, some of whom left Cupids and moved to Harbor Grace in around 1617. Harbor Grace continued to be Bristol's port in Newfoundland into the early 19th century, so for well over 200 years. You know what these guys are like? They're merchants. There's going to be paper trails. They're going to be buying and selling stuff. There have to be, if you're going to find it anywhere, I think you're going to find it in Harbor Grace. And Harbor Grace is also in Conception Bay, so we have the advantage of having, it's in the Conception Bay Plantation book. And actually, this is something that I'm working on right now. And there is a document. I'll mention it to you. I don't know if anybody knows about. Does anybody know about the Harbor Grace indenture? You heard of the Harbor Grace indenture? Nobody does. It's a document that's here at the Hunter Library. It's been here in Newfoundland since the 1930s, and trying to think of her name now, Morgan at the Bonnie. I'm sorry, Bonnie. I've been, my mind is going. Bonnie, I'm sorry. Bonnie approached me, what, 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, something like that. And she said, I've got a document from Harbor Grace. It's a 17th century document. It's never been transcribed. Could you transcribe it for us? And I was sort of like, yeah, well, maybe it is, but she sent me some photographs, and it's the real thing, right? And what it is, when I transcribed it, it's an indenture. 4 of the merchants that own the plantation in Harbor Grace are selling 1/3 of the plantation to Francis Creswick, or I forget the amount, it's 300 pounds or whatever, plus a share of 2 ships. Do you know about Robert Hayman, who's the last governor of Harbor, the only governor that's ever mentioned in Harbor Grace? The old story that people tell is that, the Bristol merchants came, they set up for a while. Robert Hayman was the only governor. He was a bit of a flake. He wrote a book of poems. He left, and then everything failed. Not the case at all. One of the merchants that is involved in this indenture that owns land in Harbor Grace in 1637 is Robert Hayman's brother-in-law, who lives just down the road on Small Street from John Guy. Right? So anyway, that's a document that I'm researching. I'm hoping to write a paper on that document. And I'm also, there are a series of unpublished documents from Bristol, the Bristol depositions, which it's a lot of stuff. Evan Jones, who's a colleague of mine who teaches at the University of Bristol, sent me JPEGs of it's about 700, 800 pages that have never been transcribed from the 1650s, 1660s. And I'm hoping that I'm going to find something in there that might link some of the planters that were listed as being in Harbor Grace in 1675 back to the Creswicks. We know the Creswicks were still active in Harbor Grace in the 1660s. They were part of a group of merchants that signed a petition uh, to Charles II when he came to the throne to encourage settlement in Newfoundland in the 1660s. So anyway, that's another line of research, and I probably talked too long. So uh, thanks, guys. That's it for me. So I probably went on. How long did I go on for? Too long. Okay. What's up? Oh.
Okay,
We can still make the PowerPoint.
we got our online people?
Nothing yet, so we can start with in person.
Oh, we have online questions as well? Maybe.
We should also, Bill, if you could repeat the questions that people ask you here. I know it's a bit repetitive, but so the online people can hear, because we don't have a separate mic, unfortunately, for all of you. So if you say just sort of
Okay.
rephrase for your answer.
Sure. Yeah.
I'll coordinate with you.
Hi, John. Oh, I'm sorry. Can we say that there are descendants from the original Cupids colony? There are certainly, it's hard to say exactly. I think we can say for sure that there are descendants from the early colonies in Carbonear and Harbor Grace. The first English child in Canada was the son of Nicholas Guy, born in Cupids in March 1613. They moved to Carbonear. We have a letter that he wrote from Carbonear in 1631, and you can trace that family in Carbonear right up through, right? There are other, the Butler family. Now, there's a Samuel Butler who's mentioned as being in Cupids in 1612. I don't know if he's related to the Thomas Butler who James Hill left the land and the property to, but certainly the Butlers were there in the 1660s, the 1670s. And that family, I mean, there's butlers all over Conception Bay. And most of them, or a lot of them, are direct descendants of those people. There are core families that certainly can trace their ancestry back to the 17th century. And I bet, considering how interrelated we all are, I bet you a lot of Newfoundlanders, somewhere along the way, if you go back far enough, you have an ancestor that's been in Newfoundland. My grandfather, yeah, my grandmother was a butler. And am I saying that? Is that right? No. My grandmother was a master's. I'm sorry. I've been at this for a long time today. My grandmother was a master's, and there were masters in Conception Bay starting, there were landowners in the 1670s, right? One of the sites that we dug in Trinity Bay, we dug in New Perlican, and at the Hefford Plantation in New Perlican, we can actually trace the Hefford family in New Perlican from the time they arrived in 1675 up to the present on the same piece of property. So, right? No paper trail, I guess, but still you can trace those people up through. So remember George, Laurie? George, yeah, George Peddle. The Peddles married into the Hefford family, and that's the land ended up being owned by the Peddles. George Peddle was a wonderful, wonderful man who was there when we were digging. He passed away a few years ago. So is that good? Okay. Anybody else have a question? Okay. Oh, Peter. Shall I repeat that one too? Yeah. What portion of the plantation site has not yet been excavated that we would most like to excavate? Yeah. I probably won't do it because I don't know how much longer I'm going to be digging there. But the next thing that I'd like, and I think I know where it is too. In 1611, John Guy built another plantation house, which he says was a far greater and fairer plantation house. That's his second house. I would really like to find that. I'd really like to find that, and I think I know where it is actually, but that's what I'd really like to find now. That, I don't know if answer. Peter's from Cupids, by the way, if you don't know. We haven't done it. I'm old fashioned. No, no, I haven't done either of those. No. Have we used metal detectors to ground penetrating radar? No, no, no. I'll leave that to somebody else down the road to do that. Anything else? Anybody else have a question? The Bristol deposition papers. Well, there's hundreds and hundreds of documents. What they are basically, anyone who sailed from Bristol on a ship, if there was a problem, something happened during the voyage, you know, the fish went bad or whatever, or they were attacked by pirates or whatever, they went into Bristol and gave a deposition before the mayor of Bristol and some of the aldermen. And those are all written down in detail, similar to the deposition that I was reading there, Humphrey Randall's deposition. So there's all kinds of stuff in it because the Bristol people were trading all over the place, you know, Barbados and everywhere. But I'm hoping to find some references to Newfoundland, and I would like specifically to find some references that would link some of the merchants that are mentioned in the Harbor Grace indenture, Francis Creswick and those people, to some of the planters that were there in the 1670s and 1680s. If you could make that connection and figure out where those people were living, you might actually be able to do the same thing for Harbor Grace that we've done for Cupids and trace the land ownership right up through to the. I bet you'd be able to do that in Harbor Grace. I bet you would. I can't see why you wouldn't be able to do that. Yeah. So, does that answer your question? Steve, you got a question? Anybody else? Oh, it's a hand.
People living there year round.
Obviously, yes, they are. Yeah, yeah. Oh, oh well, no, yeah. Well, no, I should repeat the question. It is what we're finding at Cupids evidence of year-round occupation. It is, obviously, it's a plantation. It's been occupied since 1610, right up through. But it's the oldest English settlement in Canada. Quebec was settled in 1608, so it's 2 years older. So if you want to, you know, okay, so, you know, everybody wants to be the oldest, right? You know, right? But I'll do one up on Quebec. Nova Scotia, the Acadian settlement in Nova Scotia, 1604, 1605. So, I mean, that's before Quebec as well, right? So, yeah, yeah. But it was Port Royal. Port Royal, yeah. Port Royal, yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But people stayed on, yeah, yeah. But then also David Kirk took that place over for a while and ran it for like, what was it, Barry, 10 years or something like that? Yeah. What, 2 years? Couple of years, yeah, before he turned it back to the French. So Kirk, who was in Fairyland after that, yeah, yeah. So, oh, there's a hand. Is that a hand? Oh, hi, Ann. I haven't seen you in a long time. Okay, yeah. My father, who was born in 1912, remembers people smoking them. Barry's the pipe expert. When do you think they stopped being like the 1960s? Yeah, yeah. When I first came to the university, I bought a clay pipe down at O'Brien's on Water Street, and took it back to the residence at Rothmere and tried to smoke it, but it only lasted like for about half an hour and then cracked in two. So they're very fragile. But I think as far as, because briars come in, right? Briars come in, Barry, in the 1880s or whatever. So they sort of start to displace clay pipes. Yeah, yeah. And you start getting them 1570, I guess, around 1570 is the earliest clay pipes. Yeah, yeah. So, and you can't tell by the bore diameter. You can get a rough idea how old they are by measuring Yeah. Okay, you can measure the bore diameter. There's a calculation that you can use to get a rough idea of how old they are. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you.
So my first one, part of the also thought, well, I'm wondering if it's larger,
Repeat the question?
yes, I know, got trouble here. First one, I was asking, about a lot of
Is the written work going to? Oh, yeah, I am. I am. First, I have 4 papers that I need to write, and you've seen summaries of 3 of them right here this evening. So, but yeah, I am. Yeah, I am planning to write a book, Peter. You've been asking me that for years. Peter's from Peter's from Cupids, and he used to work at the Cupids Legacy Center, so I know Peter really well. How has experience been working with private owners of land and excavation? It's been mixed. But I mean, Garland and Ruth Baker, whose land we dug on for years, and they were just wonderful to us. And we almost became like family, really, you know. And and also, had it not been for Garland and Ruth and their welcoming attitude, this may never have happened, because we might not have been able to get in there to do the digging that we did do and come up with the evidence to prove that what we had actually was the plantation. I don't know if does that answer the question, I guess? Okay. Okay.
a son and my family actually.
Oh yeah, they were smoking tobacco in the clay pipes. So the questions are, were there families at the plantation and were they smoking tobacco? That's 2 separate questions. Yes, there were families. The first women arrived in 1612. And I guess the first family that we know of is Nicholas Guy's family, because his wife gave birth to the first English child on the 27th of March, 1613. So that's a family. And we also know that John Guy's brother Philip, his wife was in Newfoundland for a number of years. I think they might have actually been in Harbor Grace as well, actually. I think they might have moved from Cupids to Harbor Grace when the Bristol people moved. There's a reference. There's even a poem dedicated to Philip Guy's wife in Robert Hayman's Book of Poetry that he wrote in Harbor Grace published in 1628. It wasn't published in Harbor Grace, but it was written in Harbor Grace and published in London in 1628. Yeah. Well. Okay.
I visited the site some years ago. There's actually some gravestones with names.
Yeah.
Is that relevant to that far back?
That's it. We got really excited when we found that cemetery. And I mean, we're still excited about it, but that seems to be an 18th century plot, but we think it's probably an extension of the original 17th century cemetery. We have the names, as you may know, I don't know if those panels were up when you were there or not, of the first 12 people to be buried in Cupids.
Remember John Morris?
John Morris, yeah, he's one of them, yeah. Marmaduke Whittington is another, yeah. So we think that this is probably an extension of that original cemetery. But digging graves is not really what I'm into, so I have a lot of other things to dig. So the area is protected. It's a provincial historic site now. So if at some point some researcher has a valid reason to go in and look for more graves, go for it. This would be wonderful. But it's not. I'm getting older and too old to be at this stuff anyway. So, anybody else, or is that, oops, there goes my magic wand.
Well, I'd like to thank opening up a window to our very rich heritage. Something we have out there. Told us it's hope that the next generation, most of us are a little bit will be back.
Yeah.
But we hope that the next generation give it more maybe somewhere else.